I was gathering water from a river for testing, to see what levels of runoff had been like. To do this, we had to gather from several different points, so many miles away from a selected location. One of those mile markers along the river took me into a patch of woods that grew pretty dense, as far as Michigan woodland goes. I was packing up the tube full of water samples when I looked up and saw something very out of place in the landscape. In the thick growth of the trees, I saw something that looked round, but not perfectly spherical, like an oversized pear suspended off the ground. I looked around, and there was nobody observing me. The rest of the team was having a coffee break as they waited for me to finish up what I was doing. So, I decided that I could steal 5 minutes to take a closer look at this strange object. I had to climb to a steep bank to get up to where I saw this oddity. Upon closer inspection, it looked like a gigantic gourd that had been hollowed out and mashed in with branches of the trees. It was very much in the family of a paper wasp or a mud dauber's nest, but the scale of it was ridiculous. Something that huge, the size of a military tank, had to have been constructed by something that also was big. My mind was filled with pictures of the so-called murder hornets that have been making news on and off, but I knew hornets weren't big enough to make something like that. Immediately, I was pulled from my thoughts by an eruption of something from the river down below. A figure had emerged that I would have mistaken for a crocodile any other day from a distance, but this thing was even bigger. Stranger yet, it walked on 2 legs, and it had a very, very husky build. It caught sight of me, and its tail began lashing like a cat's. I made a mental connection between its reaction and the object I was investigating. I got out my little pink taser just in case. I had no idea if it would be any good. I began backing away from the nest, or whatever it was, away from the edge of the bank where the main lizard thing would surely appear. It did not disappoint. It looked every bit like an angry parent. I held my taser out, and it suddenly felt very small in my hand. The creature looking much taller when it stood on the same level as I. I kept backing up slowly, my taser extended, trying to get across that I didn't want any trouble, but that I was also capable of defending myself if need be. It looked as though it were going to let me leave as it stood and stared for a very long time. But something inside of it snapped, and it appeared to charge me with its mouth full, open wide. The split second of being rushed was the single most terrifying instance of my life. My taser popped and crackled, and my world went blurry for half a second. The business end of the taser had done its job, and for the briefest of moments, this creature had touched me, and when you tase an attacker that's touching you, you also tase yourself. The disorientation didn't last long, but the fear was still tearing through my body. So, are walking man lizards really a thing? I haven't really listened to your show before now. It's not easy being surrounded by people, but feeling so alone because you have a traumatic story to tell that nobody will believe. I signed up to be an archaeological assistant. It sounds pretty important, but all it means is that you get flown out to a remote location where everybody is so focused on digging something up that they forget about all their comforts and necessities, like a little kid that plays video games until they pee their pants. I didn't get to be directly involved in any of the digging or cataloging of the finds. I got to haul around food and water and rubble and everything unimportant that nobody wanted in the way of more serious work. My story marks my last outing under this kind of employment. Something happened that could have been prevented, and that nobody on site even tried to do anything about. I'm not even sure they were concerned if I was alright. The dig site was at a recently discovered Mayan ziggurat. Don't get too excited, it wasn't very big. It's actually one of the smallest on record, and it might end up in National Geographic for 2 pages. But other than that, there's nothing truly remarkable about it, at least as far as the information they're willing to disclose. There was an extensive system of catacombs under. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that it was bigger underneath than it was on top. It was also very dark, and this team had not come prepared for extensive lighting, which was ridiculous, because the underground work was where most of their efforts began to take place. I'm quietly claustrophobic, and more than a little afraid of the dark. When I signed up under the impression that I'd be mostly working outside, and it's probably what they had in mind at the same time too. But with the discovery of the catacombs underneath, my job description began to receive radical revisions. I kept getting called underground to be removing large chunks of rubble and dirt and other things that nobody else wanted to deal with. Basically a glorified pack mule. Going underground to take care of those little projects was kind of like holding my breath to go underwater to retrieve something. It was just too intense. I had to be continuously pacing myself, and this made my supervisors agitated. It was when I got called underground to a smaller chamber that took a little too long to reach. I started to become undone. The way to do this little chamber was extremely poorly lit, and I stubbed my foot hard more than once. I actually got there at some point or another, and a supervisor told me to take care of all the rocks that were in the way. We weren't allowed to use any lighting that wasn't provided, but I went ahead and used my cell phone and lit up the area. I found that the rocks I was supposed to be hauling out looked nothing like rocks. They resembled eggs, most of them near the size of beach balls, and encrusted with all manners of dirt and slime and other liquid I was afraid to identify. I did voice my concern, and my superiors told me to just shut up and do my job. That's what the moment I should have walked out, but realistically, there was nowhere to go after this. I began hauling the eggs out in the open, above ground. I had to pace myself. The darkness was just too much, and the overall creep factor of these eggs was rather high. It was when I had carried the last of the eggs top of the ground that there was a piercing scream from the entrance. Everybody turned to see one of the archaeologists scrambling, when something appeared to grab him from behind and drag him back in. Everybody had looked at each other, and even I could almost feel it, what they were thinking. Only one of the people on site was armed, the one designated as a security guard, which, incidentally, was a person who looked like he had never actually used a gun in his life. He did a great deal of waffling, while whatever was underneath came flying outside and mauled 2 or 3 more of us. To give it a best description, it as a crocodile would be grossly inaccurate. It had similarities, but its head was very round, and its mouth was short compared to something like a crocodile. Its body was more round, almost like you described somebody that was heavy set. The eyes were proportionately huge compared to the rest of the head. Think stereotypical aliens. Give that mental image a reptilian cast, and then you have the head structure of this thing, minus the smaller, frailer body. By the time the guard had his gun out and had the nerve to take a shot, he was already being charged and several bodies littered to the ground. I never experienced a bloodbath before in my life, but I wonder if this is anything close to how soldiers feel in combat. I can remember that the first few shots staggered it. One bullet, thankfully, hit it in its head, and surprisingly, it didn't kill it. There was a strange crunching sound. All the eggs, at least the ones around us, were beginning to crack open. I had no idea what to even do at that point. My experience with the entire situation was as fascinating as it was traumatic. Even now, as I'm typing this up for you, all those years later, it's making me shake and shiver, and my keyboarding is suffering for it. As you might have suspected, all the evidence of the monster and what had happened was covered up, probably due to liability more than anything else. I don't think the job had any connection to the government, so it's not like there was a controlled effort to cover up the existence of the species. I don't know if this would be classified as reptilian or what. All the reptilians I've ever heard about are supposedly shape-shifting, scheming demons that are trying to, better yet, manipulate the human race. This felt more like encountering a gorilla than anything else. I love to swim. It's one of my favorite things to do. On top of that, I love finding places that are a little more unusual to take a bath in. So, not pools or lakes or the ocean. I prefer rivers and swamps and springs, places that can be found off the beaten track. Now, of course, I know these places can tend to be dangerous. I'm a very competent and strong swimmer, but I don't fancy my chances against a gator, so I'm not dumb. I have seen all sorts of weird stuff in those rivers and swamps. Even once found a body. Didn't stick around too long after I noticed it was a human swaying against the current. I dialed 911, and I was out of there. Turned out to be some poor runaway. At least the parents got closure, and the body buried. You think that would be the worst thing I've ever seen, right? Well, it isn't. One day, I was out deep in Louisiana swamps, and I saw something that utterly blew my mind. As I said, I like to find hidden, unique away places to take a dip, but I'm also careful not to end up as some croc's dinner. Well, in and around, you gotta be careful. Snakes are dangerous too. I've seen some of them crawling around near the water, and a damn side bigger than I am. So, what I found this stretch of water, it was like some offshoot from the bayou. I did all my usual checks and balances before I even put a foot. I couldn't see any obvious signs. I stuck a long stick in the water, swirled it up real good, and no long slithering body surfaced. So, I thought I was safe. I got in, feeling that immense pleasure that I get from knowing I may be the only person around here. As I'm slowly swimming around, feeling pleased with myself and very smug, I instantly get the sensation when you know somebody or something is looking at you. I could feel these eyes boring into my back. Also, I'm used to some funky smells hitting me when I'm out there in these waters, especially the swamps, where stagnant mud gets all swirled about. But this was awful. Like a damn stank, like I was on a pig farm, and they'd been rolling around in their own feces all day. I turned around, real slow-like, as I don't want to spook whatever's behind me, just praying real hard that it wasn't no gator. If I told you that finding a human foot was like finding Santa had been on Christmas morning compared to what I now saw in the water, that might suggest to you just how much fear I was experiencing. It weren't no gator. Well, not any kind of gator like I've ever seen. It was bigger than me and was standing in the water. The river wasn't that deep if I was to stand, my feet on the ground. It would likely come up to my waist. The thing in front of me must have been real tall, as the water barely covered where his groin is. It was real strong looking. Its torso was like that of an alligator or reptile, but if you flipped it onto its back, all scaly but real ripped and muscly. It did have human-like arms, dangling from the side, rather than little gator limbs, although its hands looked like they were webbed and clawed. It had a long, thick neck. Again, I could literally see the muscles throbbing, like some bodybuilder on steroids. And then finally, the head. Now, it didn't have a regular alligator-looking head. Like anything, nothing about what I was looking at was normal in any way. The head resembled more of a lizard or a snake. Large bulbous shapes with no visible nose or ears, just two large yellow eyes and a large forked mouth. Tons of tiny sharp teeth. It just stood there, standing its ground, not moving closer to me, but not backing away further. I really thought I was a goner. I kind of got the hint that it was contesting its ground. Maybe somebody would be finding my dismembered body floating around in the water. That's if this thing didn't just decide to devour me whole. So, you know what I did. I screamed, as loud and powerful as I possibly could. I screamed and screamed, like I doubt I had since I was a preschooler. I think I might have freaked it out. Whether it didn't like the frequency, or being afraid made me scream like a girl, or how loud it was, I guess looking back I'll never know. But the more noise I made, it seemed like it was getting really annoyed or pissed. It quickly moved out of the way and into the nearby brush. I stayed there for a few moments longer, catching my breath, and then hoping I was about to die of having a damn heart attack, having survived a freak encounter with a reptoman. Thankfully, I managed to muster up some strength from somewhere, and I too ran out of the river and back to my car, where I didn't even bother changing, just drove home in wet clothes and wet shorts. Don't feel like I scared it off. I think I merely irritated it. It didn't seem too happy about me yelling and screaming and making noise. It seemed irritated, if I had to guess its proper demeanor. Now, why it went off to the bush to my left, I don't know. Part of me likes to think that it was circling around in the brush to come and grab me from behind. But I don't know, because once it exited into the brush, I couldn't hear it anymore. So, that means it could have been possibly waiting to trap me, or even worse, take me away and kill me. We were the first small town in our state to have a nuclear power plant constructed within the town limits. We were told that it was supposed to just be big enough to power us, and they wanted to see what the long-term impact of a nuclear power was on a smaller community. My parents being hardcore environmentalists, and they opposed it from the first whisper of it, which was well before I was ever born. So, it's been around for a long time. I've been paying attention to how my parents felt about the whole thing, and I had also been listening to everybody else's side of the story. This was also the time when just about every phone now had a video camera in it, so it wasn't a stretch of the imagination when I got the notion to go and try and make a documentary about the plant. I didn't share my plans with my parents, because they would have forbidden me to go anywhere near that place, treating it like Chernobyl. I didn't want to be too obvious about what I was doing, so I took the shirt that I was planning on wearing, which was just a denim button-up shirt that had plenty of pockets on the front, and I modified one of the pockets so there would be an opening where the lens of the camera could see out. It wouldn't be a fully unobstructed vision, but it would be better than having the thing out in the open where everybody saw what I was up to. I didn't think anybody in that place was expecting a 17-year-old kid to just walk in and interview people. Everybody was looking at each other, as if this was their first time ever dealing with anybody outside. I politely asked every single person I saw that I would like to speak to whoever ran the place, since I was doing an interview for a personal project. I held a notepad to draw my attention away from the camera, and just like that, the director of the entire facility was paged to come and see me. I remember him being pleasant enough, as far as first impressions go. He had invited me up to his office on the 4th story. He put me at ease and asked me how much he could help me. I told him what I was up to. It was a very pleasant exchange. So, after everything was done, I put the SD card of my phone into my laptop and reviewed the footage. It was remarkable high quality, and the field of view was all but entirely unobstructed. But the longer I watched, the more I saw that I did not remember. The director smiling far less than I remember. Instead, he had this glassy, intense stare. When he sat with me for his interview, his eyes transformed, like having long slit pupils, and his skin looking pale and slightly scaly in appearance, whispering something bizarre under his breath. After those mutterings, I wordlessly got up and marched at a slow pace outside the building on my way back home. There had never been an interview based on what I saw. After going through the footage, there was no actual interview at all. I just sat down with him, and he muttered at me. After studying the footage where he was saying those strange things under his breath, when his eyes transformed, I couldn't help but remark at how much he looked kind of like a snake or serpentine. He definitely resembled something that was cold-blooded. I don't know if what he did to me was hypnoticism or something else entirely, but I just know that it somehow created false memories in me while wiping out others. What's your take on this? And I'm curious what your listeners would think of this. Not to be presumptuous to think that you would actually broadcast my story, but if you do, I appreciate it. I'm sure there are others like me that have very similar experiences with possibly similar beings and would like to feel validated. Thank you for even taking the time to read this. I was wandering around the woods, a much older growth of oak trees that had seen times long gone by. So, many of the trunks were massive, and many of them were also hollowed out. I was leaning up against one of them, listening to the subtlety of the breeze, when I thought I heard something stirring. It wasn't a scraping sound like you'd expect from the claws of an animal, but somehow softer and more wet. After my curiosity took hold, I started looking for an opening, which wasn't hard to find. This was a large open gash where a cavity had formed over the centuries. There was something that looked akin to the egg sac of a spider, except it was much larger. I usually don't go out of my way to disturb nature, but I couldn't leave this alone. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like it. I took out my pocket knife and began making slight cuts. At first, I thought I discovered the abdomen of an incredibly large baby spider, but the abdomen turned out to be the head of something else. Combine the features of an iguana and a chameleon and a snake and give it human-like eyes, and that's as best as I can describe what was suspended. After a few seconds, this thing's eyes shot up and looked at me. A deafening shriek from behind me made me jump back and stop what I was doing. Something much taller than I, much uglier than me, and yet vaguely resembling the small thing I had just seen in the tree, stood only 3 meters away, leaning forward with its spine parallel to the ground, hissing at me, revealing tons of vicious crocodile-like teeth. I'll always remember that as terrifying. It's a sight that has never left my memory. I immediately stepped away from the tree, and this creature, whatever it was, took the opportunity and lunged forward, doing what I believe bluff charged me. It had the ability to kill me, but chose not to for some reason. I took that as my cue to get the hell out of there, not even looking behind me in case this thing was coming after me. I paid it no more mind. Anyway, I wanted to send my encounter into you, in hopes that someone else has heard something similar, or maybe you have gotten other stories with a similar finding. I feel like mine's a little out there, but nonetheless, just as terrifying. I live in the Carolinas, and there are plenty of swamplands around here. You can't avoid them, but if you grew up around here, you know the rules, and don't go anywhere near them without being covered in bug spray. And watch out for snakes and alligators. But what if I told you I saw something down there once, which made me think I'd take 100 mosey bites instead? Let me tell you about it. You see, I was driving back from work one night when I noticed the car started pulling, and I realized I had a flat. I pulled over and checked. Sure enough, one of the front wheels was flapping. I work in a bar, and sometimes the patrons get a little feisty. Must have been a fight outside, and some glass didn't get picked up, and of course I had to drive over it. Now, I know you're always meant to carry a spare. It was one of around 1 million things I had on my to-do list, which hadn't yet gotten done. So now, I'm stuck on the side of the road. Of course near the swamps, because I couldn't have broken down in town, with all the streetlights and people around. So I'm trying to decide whether to call AAA or a buddy to come help out. And that's right when I hear this strange noise. Of course, being near swampland in the evening, there are all sorts of noises. Creatures that live in there go about their business. But this sounded different. At first, I thought maybe somebody was just passing by. That someone had seen my car and pulled over further down the road, which I'd somehow missed, and now they were coming to help. Because that was what it sounded like. Footsteps. Wet footsteps. Like maybe somebody had been wading through water. I looked down the street both ways, but surprisingly, I couldn't see whoever was making the noise. But that was because I was obviously looking at the road. When I turned back toward the swamp, I saw exactly who, or more accurately what, was making the noise. It looked like a lizard. But not a regular lizard. That would have been too normal. But never fear, because this lizard was humanoid-like. I didn't know that at the time. I just stood there, with my mouth hanging open, doing all the usual things like pinching myself, rubbing my eyes to see if I was truly dreaming. I was unfortunately very much awake, staring at what I can only say is this lizard man, or what I thought of him until I got home and tried to do some research. The best way for me to describe him is that he kind of looked a bit like an alligator, with 2 human-like legs, only with a much thinner body and long legs. It's actually quite hard for me to accurately describe. I guess because my mind wants desperately to try and make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Yeah, he looked really tall, easily like a regular person, but was very thick and scaly, really powerful looking arms and legs. His head was just like an actual lizard or alligator. Long jaws with large teeth and a snout, eyes that bugged out on the sides of his face. He was just slowly wading through the swamp water, heading right for me in my direction. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hazard that guess that they don't teach shop or mechanics to lizard people, so I can only think that this thing was going to hurt me. So I grabbed my phone and keys, and I ran, as far away from the swamp and my car as possible, until I got to the safety of some houses and streetlights about a mile or so down the road. Then, I called one of my friends to come pick me up. Now, he is a lot braver, or more stupid. Then, he drives back with a huge pickup truck. When I told him what I'd seen, he immediately wanted to go back and check it out. The shotgun he had in the back made me feel braver, but still, there was the risk. We headed back to my car, which was still exactly where I'd left it, so I guess this lizard dude wasn't into stealing my vehicle. My friend Nate jumps out of the pickup, shotgun in hand, and starts shouting and hollering. But of course we don't see anything. I have no idea exactly what that thing was or what it intended to do. All I knew was I didn't want to hang about and find out. But as I said, once I was feeling a bit braver, I looked, and not only did I find your channel, I found a lot of similar disturbing sightings. So it seems lizard men or alligator men gets around, and apparently, judging from your other encounters, there's a whole family of them living around here in the swamps up in southeastern America. There are some things your mom tells you that you should really listen to. Of course, when we are kids, we always think that we know best. But listen, there's often a reason why they tell you not to do certain things, but we usually end up finding them out the hard way. For example, my mother told us kids not to play in the stream at the bottom of the field because it was dirty and boggy, and you never know what you might find or catch in there. It was like telling us kids not to eat sweets because they'd rot your teeth out. Like a moth to a flame, we were drawn to the stream even more after being warned. So, one day, after a particularly rainy night, my little brother and I headed straight to the stream, knowing it would be overflowing, thus even more enticing. We played with sticks, trying to find newts, made newspaper boats, and did all of the things that any child would do near a stream. We pulled up our joggers and stomped in the muddy water, and that was when we saw the ripples. Ripples meant air, which meant something was living in there rather than just the water and flies we had seen so far. This made us excited. Now, I have no idea what to be expected in the muddy, boggy stream, but what came out of the water would blow our tiny 8 to 10-year-old minds. It, or he, or they, must have been laying low on the ground under the stream, as when it stood up and rose from the water, there was no way he could have possibly been covered by that level of water otherwise. It was around our height, so about 4 feet or so, and looked like something straight out of a comic book. Covered in greenish scales, weird fins and gills. He kind of had a squat body and long bowed legs, and thin arms and webbed hands and feet. I'm not trying to be mean. It was very amphibious looking, and it was kind of funny, but also frightening. Rising out of the stream was this creature, only he wasn't so little to us at the time, since he was around our size. My brother and I were caught between fear and excitement. Our mouths were wide open. It's not exactly what you would expect to see. I'd like to say that we weren't scared, but we were both terrified. We did not expect to see anything like that. He sort of just looked at us, unamused, then turned around and jolted off. We ran all the way home and didn't stop until we were back inside the kitchen with my mom, who just looked at us as if to say, "See, I told you not to go into the stream." It's like deep down she knew we shouldn't have been there, and that maybe there was more dangerous things than what we could have thought. Of course now, this was so many years ago, but as an adult, it's fun to think back and realize that there are animals that exist that go beyond the realm of our imagination. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I certainly do believe in undiscovered species of animals. As far as an explanation for what me and my brother saw, well, I have no idea what animal that was. People have asked me before if you ever really get used to living in gator country. I don't exactly know how to answer them. It's like asking if you ever get used to living around a hornet's nest. Sure, the sights and sounds will grow on you, but if you get stung, you get stung, and it doesn't hurt any less if you've seen them once a week or once an hour. So it is with gators. You get eaten, you die, no matter how used you are to seeing them. I've been living in gator country for my 45 years, and I haven't lost any arms or legs yet. I do think I have lost some nerves with some close encounters I've had, and one in particular stands out, since I'm not sure if I can really blame the gators for it. I had just enough southern comfort to make me braver than I should have been, and when I get brave, I like to go exploring. I want to take the canoe, the lantern if I need it, and go looking around. I know what a gator looks like, especially when it's trying to pretend to be a drifting log, and no amount of drink can blind me to it. It's a sight that I know by heart. But I came across something entirely new, really. It's a miracle that it did not cost me my life, since I went in to greet death, eyes wide open. So I'm out there exploring, driven by curiosity, fanned by the flame of a good buzz. The passages I could row down were getting narrower and narrower, and the reeds were growing closer together. I came to a clearing where I swear I saw what looked like tall, green pineapples growing up out of the water. They had the same overall shape and texture, except that they had something like scales on the outside, and the whole lot of things would twitch and bounce in a while. There was also the occasional burp sound, indicating the expulsion of either air or fluids. If I had been smart or sober, I would have hightailed it back home, but I wasn't sober. Like a big kid that had just discovered big pine cones, I had to see what sort of secrets those big scaly green things held. My knife was barely any good on them. I could get the blade under a scale and peel it off without great effort, but that was it. The things were well armored. I was able to comprehend well enough that it was some sort of egg or embryo, but I didn't reflect long enough on what sort of thing made them, and whether said thing would be nearby to protect the brood. At first, I thought it was a gator rearing up to attack me. Then I thought the whiskey might have been spiked with something stronger than just alcohol, because I saw what could have passed as a gator walking on its two back legs, keeping its balance just fine and holding its body upright with the grace of a cobra. The head, though, was shorter than your usual gators, and the eyes were larger. The mouth also hung open a bit, and all the teeth you'd ever expect to see were there. But there was an alertness, an intelligence in those eyes that I'd never seen in any gator's eyes. It must have been Mama, and she was not thrilled to see me. I took out my dad's revolver, which was empty, and aimed it at my attacker. And she, or it, seemed to understand immediately, freezing in place. I abandoned my phone that I had just dropped in the water, and I ran. Last thing I remember was somebody calling my name from far away. After that, I blacked out. Apparently, my wife had come back looking for me when I didn't show up at nightfall. They had pretty much been on my heels when I was busy, tussling with my scaly little friend. I can't think of any other explanations as to why I'm still here. Whatever that thing was that lived in the swamp surely would have eaten me alive if it had just been me and her. I've never seen an alligator like that before, nor do I know exactly what it was. I feel weird for even using the term alligator. While it resembled an alligator, a lot of its defining features were very human-like. So was it an alligator man, dare I say? I don't know. And its eggs. I found its eggs, or embryos. Either way, I'm very disturbed, and hopefully this information will do better to you than it will to me. I was a part of a research expedition in the Amazon rainforest. We were looking for some indications that some plants could cure modern diseases. It's another big secret that the worldwide medical system needs all the help it can get. The locals had directed us to an especially dense grove of trees that produced these small, strange yellow fruits. And no, not lemons. When taken back for research, it was found that early-stage cancer cells dried up immediately by substances and proteins found within this particular fruit. Just to say, my superiors were eager to get their hands, and on only these fruits, but also on seeds of this particular tree, so they could look into propagating them in a controlled environment as soon as possible. The natives had warned that not too much of the fruit should leave the grove at any given time. Otherwise, the forest would be angry. We thought that was a joke. Well, I was hoping that 3 small crates would not be considered greedy by the forest. I was nailing the last lid on the crate when we all heard a blood-chilling howl. Staring in between the trees were sets of large compound eyes that shifted colors, primarily between green and yellow. They were set in faces that were mostly olive green, with some molted gray and brown. At first, I made them out to be people that were covered in a great deal of war paint. Makes sense. Maybe we had disturbed the territory of some uncontacted Amazonian tribe. But then I saw that they weren't people at all. I saw teeth, like shark teeth, and lots of thick scales, claws that resembled meat hooks, faces that ranged from every structure resembling to a Komodo dragon to even modern crocodiles. I don't think I've ever ran so fast in my life. My veins were on fire, and my heart felt like it would have stopped at any minute. After a very long time, I looked behind me to see that the creatures were not pursuing me. I tried to find my way back to that grove, and I never could. The expedition was considered a large-scale failure, and before we could leave the country, we were greeted by Brazilian military who confiscated our 3 crates and took the expedition leader and nearly detained him before giving him a good talking. We were told and demanded to leave the country as soon as we could and to never return. I'm not exactly sure why it was necessary for the Brazilian military to get involved, or why they felt it was necessary to confiscate the fruit and threaten us and demand we leave. Something is going on. I believe they knew something was up with that grove, and the warnings we had received prior about that same grove were probably in hopes that we would never venture to there. Who knows what we were not supposed to see that we had seen. I had taken a long fishing trip to a more isolated region of Alaska. Granted, every part of Alaska is considered isolated. A lot of places you can only reach by airplane. Where I was at was isolated, even by the standards of Alaskan natives. For miles in any direction, it was just me, and waters, and tall grasses, and pines, and blue skies. At least, that's what I thought. I was spending the night staring at the moon. There's something about it that's hypnotic and mesmerizing. I would then stare at the water. I would then see disturbances in the water. At the time, I just attributed this to the fish, which made me look forward to the catches during the day. But there were some things about the disturbance in the water that I could not account for. Protrusions above the water that didn't belong to any fish that I knew of. And believe me, if anyone knew fish, it was me. In the middle of one night, I woke up by virtue of some deep down instinct. I was in trouble, but I couldn't have told you why. I consciously stepped out of my tent and looked around. I didn't see any wolves or coyotes or bears, but when I looked towards the water, I saw some hunchback shape with a long tail. I could make out the silhouette of long claws, a spiked dorsal plate that ran up and down the back all the way to the tip of the tail. At first, I gasped, thinking this was a real-life dinosaur that was probably hunting at night, and would make sense since they were nocturnal. The movement of the water seemed very strange. That's when I realized that I was looking at more than one of the same creature, perhaps dozens. They were pacing at the edge of the water. Each time I got something like a clear glimpse of their heads, they were turned toward me. I had a sinking sensation in my stomach as I was aware of the vast empty miles of wilderness that surrounded me. I could run for hours and not even see a single soul. I was alone out there with these things that were very much aware of me. Safe to say, I didn't sleep much the rest of that trip. A few of those nights I didn't sleep at all, and the times that I did sleep, it was out of sheer exhaustion. I don't know why those dinosaur creatures never bothered to engage me. Maybe they were just guarding something, and they were making sure that this human being wasn't going any further. Either way, I still see those shapes stalking me in my sleep, circling me like sharks. But that's probably my own fear and trauma of the experience. To this day, I honestly believe I saw real-life dinosaurs. I was driving home one afternoon through some thick farmland, admiring the open fields, and thinking to myself how lucky I was to be able to have a steady job in the town and then come home to my house out in the countryside. It was a glorious springtime day when the sun was just about still shining and the trees were starting to look green and healthy again. I was just enjoying looking around and taking in the sights when I saw something run out in front of me onto the road. I never travel too fast for this very reason on the windy roads, as you never know what might spring out of the hedges, and I have had a near miss with a deer before, in which I'm still not sure of which was more startled. This thing was far enough in front of me for me to be able to apply the brakes carefully and ease my already low speed without causing any issues. There were no other cars about anyway. This also gave me the chance to be able to see what type of creature this particular jaywalker was. It was some sort of lizard reptile. That much I do know. And if I hadn't seen it with my own two eyes, I never would have even believed it was there. That would be because of the greenish scales covering its body. Where something like that had come from or was heading off to, I have no idea. There is water around here, but not exactly huge lakes or swamps. Still, it was there, crossing the road. A reptile of which I had never seen the like before. You see, unless most of its kin, it wasn't slithering across the road, or scampering on four little feet like a gecko. No, this creature was strolling across the road on 2 feet. Upright, like a person. It appeared to have tiny legs and webbed feet, a long scaly body, and even tiny arms. It almost looked like a lizard, or an alligator had just decided that 2 feet would be the way to go. Its body looked all wrong. Not that there was anything even remotely normal about what I was seeing. It was more like a human torso, but covered in green scales with reptilian limbs. And then was the head. Have you ever seen the creature from the Black Lagoon? That odd-shaped head, with like flat gills on the side. Well, that was what it was on top of this messed up long human lizard. It wasn't that tall either, maybe 3 feet at most. Once it clocked the car, it turned and stared at me for a moment. Bug-wide eyes, never blinking. Then it sped off faster than I never would have thought. I sat there, my car idling, wondering what on earth I had just seen. It didn't appear threatening, and I wasn't exactly scared, more in awe and disbelief. After a few moments, when it seemed I wouldn't be making a return journey, I simply carried on my way home. But I'll never exactly forget what I saw that evening. A few years ago, I was on my way back from a work conference when I began to feel really tired. I know myself well enough to recognize that I needed a break and to try and catch a few Z's before I fell asleep at the wheel. So I pulled over the road into a lay-by and just closed my eyes. I must have needed it, as the next thing I know, I jolted awake and checked my phone. I'd been out for nearly 3 hours, and now the sun was beginning to rise. Now it was brighter, and I could see that I had parked very close to some water. A lake or reservoir, maybe. I decided to get out of the car, just for a minute or two, for a quick stretch, as my legs were all pins and needles, and I had a crick in my neck from not sleeping properly. As I got out, I noticed the car had some footprints. It wasn't hard to notice as the paint job is white, and the prints were muddy. But there was something unusual about them. They were spaced out, as if whatever had taken a walk straight over my car had been on 2 legs, and even more bizarre, had webbed feet. For a moment, I thought about maybe a goose, as they have 2 legs and webbed feet. But on closer inspection, although I am no expert on the size of bird feet, these prints looked much bigger, as if a man-sized web-foot creature had used my car as a bridge. The footprints were also pointed towards the water, so whatever had gone over the car had more or less plunged straight in. I could then also see that there was a large puddle on the roadside where the footprints began. I stared out into the water for ages, trying to make sense of it. But no matter what, I just couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation as to why I had a man-sized lizard footprint on my car that just disappeared into the water. So, I listened to YouTube channels for a while, and I found yours. And you seem to know a lot of stuff about this particular subject. Would you mind sharing some helpful advice? Dogs can be a blessing and a curse. They are great when they come and lovingly wag their tail, and they are fun when you needed an excuse to get off your butt and go for a walk. They are not so great when they need to go out at 10 p.m., when it is cold, dark, and pouring rain, especially when they need to go, and they've been trained not to poop in the yard. So that was why on a cold, wet, dark night, I found myself in the woods behind the house, cursing my dog who seemed to be constipated by the amount of time he was taking to find a decent spot. I stood there, stomping my feet and blowing on my hands trying to keep warm, trying not to notice the rain trickling down on the back of my jacket, when I heard some rustling in the trees, not on the side where the dog was though. After all, we were the ones trespassing at the time, which is why I wasn't worried. The nocturnal creatures were ready to come out and play, and the last thing they needed was to see a human and a huge dog that wouldn't make up its mind where to squat. There was a sort of wet hissing noise. I know that sounds like an odd way to describe it, but that was what it was. A bit like when you go swimming and swallow too much water. More rustling and shaking of leaves, and I shouted at the dog to hurry up, or I was leaving him there all night on his own. Not that he understood or cared, but it's what we do. More rustling, and for the first time, I noticed that the rustling wasn't coming from the ground by around. It was the same height as around me in the trees, I thought it was odd, sure. It could have been a squirrel, but one may have been much higher up. And then it stepped out. The first thing I thought was that it must be some kind of kid dressed up. It was too late to be alone in the woods, and Halloween wasn't for ages away. But as I was just good staring at it, I began to think that if it was costume or makeup, it was Hollywood-level special effects. From its feet to its head, it was covered in what looked to me, because of the poor lighting, brown, scaly skin. It was just a bit taller than me, and skinny as a rake, with long dangly arms and long legs like a supermodel would have. I didn't know if it was male or female. The torso was just flat, and I couldn't see any parts to give it a sex. Then was the head. It was flat and long, not round or oval like a person, but squat like an actual snake, with eyes on either side, and huge lidless eyes. The dog noticed too, letting out a noise, followed by a whimper, while running over to me. That was enough to frighten off this snake, and it kind of slithered off. I don't know how it could have slithered. It had long legs, but that's what the movement reminded me of. The dog began barking frantically, and tried to chase this thing. I was able to grab him and pull him back to the house. He was at my heels when we got inside. He whined and begged, and acted crazy for a while. Now I can't drag him into those woods when it's dark. I can't have imagined it. If the dog saw it too, that must mean we really did see something out there that we can't explain. I'm pretty confident, what lurks beneath, that I am not hallucinating. What are your thoughts on my encounter? Although it's already been almost 14 years to the day, I encountered something horrendous when I was out down in the Sonoran Desert years and years ago with a couple of close friends of mine exploring. Before you write me off as a phony for exploring the soaring heat of the desert, since it usually can get up to 120 degrees, my friends and I felt pretty acclimated and would go and explore in short bursts when we could. We've always been fascinated by the desert climate, the environment, the plants, and just the plains itself. Just being out in that environment, it brings something out of you, something that yearns to learn more about the earth itself. I only have a little bit of native in me, and I'm not exactly sure what tribe, but I have a very few close circle of friends that are full native, and it's always been our thing to go and explore the areas we can that are close by, even if it is for only short little bursts of time due to the extreme heat and dryness. Before I continue my story, I want you to know that before I did this, I was well aware of the things that live out in the desert, supposedly, like Skinwalkers and other supernatural entities that are said to do harm to you. Well, during the daytime, I figured we'd be fine and didn't pose any threat or any alertness to any supernatural entities looking to do harm. That's where I had it wrong, and although I don't consider what we ran into a supernatural entity, it is something of evil, or so I believe, and my friends believe. It is not a natural creature, and had something very different about it, a different kind of energy that I can't really describe. While the Sonoran Desert is beautiful and desolate at the same time, it holds a lot of beautiful plant life and very dangerous animal life, like rattlesnakes for one, and other dangerous animals. But what we encountered this day was something I had never heard of before, although some of my native friends believe they have heard of it, and that their elders have spoken of it and even warned about it. Now that I know these creatures exist, I'll be much more careful in my explorations of the desert and the areas that I dwell around. In fact, because of this, I'm not sure I even have much of an appetite for more adventuring in the desert. What I encountered that day is what I can only describe as large desert serpent beings that are more than triple the length of us. I'm talking easily 20 feet, if not longer in length, and large enough to swallow a man whole. These were gargantuan serpents, pale white and streaks of yellow and gold, whatever these beings or serpents were. They came off as something unnatural. They carried a different energy around them, not like a typical animal you'd run into. So I don't want you to listen to this and think it's just some sort of snake we ran into. This had a totally different feel to it. And like I said, it had an energy to it, just like a foreboding energy, an omen, like you were not supposed to be around it, or that we had gone too far in an area we were not allowed to go into, which makes the entire event very interesting. At the time, nearly 14 years ago, my friends and I were not only exploring, but we had a destination in mind for our mission. One of my friends was told about a small little supposed burial ground not too far away. It sounded like it was unmarked, but it had a magic barrier around, or so we were told, and warned profusely not to go around there. My friends and I, although not being native myself, but they are, none of us really believed in that hocus pocus, or if we did, it was at a very ritualistic level, very minimal, and we never would have thought that something like this would have happened. I know. Me saying this probably sounds incredibly far-fetched and out of reality, but I'm telling you, I have no desire to make something like this up. There's nothing that I can gain from it personally. My best assumption is that whatever these things were had to do in part with this burial ground that we were close to. Perhaps these things were summoned or called to be guardians of this place. I don't really know. We never really got answers, because after encountering these things, we were too scared to tell the people that told us not to go around there, so we kinda just kept it between ourselves. And even now, 14 years later, we've still kept it a secret, due to shame and punishment from our elders and our family. I can remember that it was a very hot day that day, just like every day in the desert, so there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But I can say the direction we were going, at the time, we weren't even sure if it was the correct way to go. We were kind of just guessing, based on the loose directions we had and where it was at, judging by the general area. And finally, after getting over a small hill, and almost coming into a dip in the valley, and the best way I can describe it, I'm not great at describing land, so forgive me, but we got to this dip in a very small valley, where we could almost feel the energy around us shift, and I'm not the only one that noticed it. My two friends, who I won't give names to the story, have also noticed a change. We all looked at each other at once, and told each other we can feel something different in the air. I can't even begin to describe the feeling, but it was almost like a change in the air, like an electromagnetic feeling, but that's really hard to pinpoint. The only way you could ever know is if you experienced it yourself. And it wasn't long after, before we felt shakes in the ground. I'm not talking about an earthquake. I'm talking about like something big moving underneath the ground. And that's when multiple of these things appeared. We felt the light rumbles underneath our feet, coming in our direction, when these large serpents, 2 of them, burst through the sand. Massive snakes. I have never in my life seen anything so big. The only thing I can draw somewhat of a comparison to is a game called Resident Evil 1, and somewhere in that game, the main character fights this really large snake. And if you go ahead and go on Google and look it up, you could probably find it. It's been forever since I played that game, but going by my memory, the snake, or boss, whatever it was, I believed was named Yawn, Y-A-W-N, just like a yawn you do when you wake up. Now, if you see a picture of this, obviously it's a fictitious game character, but that size should give you somewhat of a good idea. The snake in the game is obviously so large that it's fictional, and the snakes we saw weren't as big. They were smaller, significantly, but not overly small to where it didn't match up. I'm trying to give you this game character because it's the only thing I could really think matches up with the size of that description, at least close. So now that you have that in your head, think that, but a pale white color, with a yellow marking down its sides and back, and a head almost resembling that of a viper, with red-yellow glinting eyes. It looked mean, and while these snakes didn't necessarily come at us to try and devour us, I got the feeling that they easily could have, had they really wanted to. They slithered around us, encircling us, as if to give us a warning. It was almost like I got the feeling and vibe to go and to not continue further. They continued to encircle us, almost like they were sizing us up, watching us before they made their move. At some point or another, all three of us began to bolt out of there and back the way we came, with these incredibly large serpents still slithering around, looking at us, sizing us up, determining what their next move was to make. We didn't give it a chance. I don't know if their plan was to attack us, and they never tried. They never moved in close or acted hostile in any way, although I do believe their entire output of emotion and energy was stay where you are or leave now. Had I felt like we tried to press on, even with their presence, they would have struck us, and that would have been the death of either of us, I just feel. A snake of that size, that could have been the end of us. I can't even begin to tell you their venom output. That's pretty much all there is to my story, and I understand that I'm not a great storyteller by any means, and I'm not an author or a writer, so this is just what you get. But I'm sure you get a lot of crazy stories, true and untrue, and I'm not here to spread false information. I'm here to tell you that there's things in the desert that we can't always be aware of or know they exist. And usually, if there's a place you're not allowed to go or forbidden to go into because of rumors or tradition, well, there's probably a reason for it, and I believe there's more there than just old wives' tales or superstitious junk. My friends and I certainly didn't tell anybody in our communities about this. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not native, so I didn't really have anybody to tell my story to, nor would they have believed me if I did. And my two friends, well, like I said, to this day, they've kept it a secret, because had they told their families or communities, they would have been punished, scolded, and severely reprimanded. I mean, after all, we were just dumb 16-year-old kids looking for an adventure, for a thrill. Hello, what lurks beneath. I'm a lifeguard at Harriet Beach in Miami, Florida. Or I was. I am writing into you to discuss and inform you of a recent incident just a few years ago on one of the beach resorts that has completely ravaged the tourism industry and led to a total lack of visitors in this very small area. Now, unless you're from there, you probably didn't really hear much of it, but this happened very quickly and was quickly cleaned up. I had been a lifeguard there for a while, about 10 years, since I was 18. I loved my job, the ocean, the people, even the beach bum life. It was my jam. But every day, I was beginning to feel this beach and resort had become something of a horror flick. Strange things had been happening. Very strange, disturbing things. At the time, and I still think there is, was a full-scale FBI investigation into the circular events occurring. Myself and the rest of the staff there were huge subjects in this investigation and were constantly being questioned. If you are reading this, well, you need to dismiss your notion of Florida as a haven of relaxation, enjoyment, and leisure, and instead, imagine a place where you feel unsafe, disturbed, and clouded in a feeling of impending terror. This is worse than Jaws. I don't know how much it's been cleaned up and taken care of since the COVID issue, but this is how it was when I was there. It was January that the first incident happened. I was catching a few waves on my surfboard, as we do when it's quiet. This was like 6 a.m., and so there wasn't many on the beach, except for a few joggers. I had my swimming shorts on and my seafoam green surfboard. It was tied to my ankle using a long leather leash like many surfers do. The currents were a little wild, and I remember feeling a little unsettled that the waves seemed to be stirring from all different directions and seemed a little erratic. They were usually totally calm and serene at this time in the morning. I saw a huge wave coming, and I couldn't wait to ride it. This was my life. Feeling free, alive, and at one with the ocean. It was an epic wave, and as I shot up on my surfboard, my glance extended right to my Pinewood Beach hut, where I would look out at the sunset with my own binoculars. As I rode that wave, feeling the electric adrenaline sent jolts of excitement up my spine and right to my head. My eyes shot down to my feet as the hazy sight of something like blood seemed to be seeping from my own ankle. Uh-oh. I gently stopped my surfboard and sat on it, putting my feet up to get a closer look. My ankle had been badly wounded, and blood was coursing out in a steady stream, modifying the azure blue with great bursts of explosive red. Okay, maybe not that dramatic, but you get the idea. It was the strangest thing, as I had zero sensation of pain and no knowledge of having been bitten by anything. Shark attacks were common, but I knew how to read the signs, and my surfboard had a fin at the bottom to avert any shark attacks from occurring. Still though, I scanned the waters and saw nothing. At that moment, I turned around at the sight of something large and green swimming about 15 feet away from me. As the water was pure from this side, I noticed it had scales, large spikes, and what looked like teeth on its back. Was this a crocodile? I didn't think we had saltwater crocodiles down here. It was utterly bizarre. This creature turned around in a circle and protruded its face above the water, so it was not facing me. That's when my stomach sank, witnessing a large creature with a face of that of a dinosaur from times gone. Large eyes the size of small footballs, green, thick, scaly skin, and a green horn which was jagged and extending about 1 foot above its forehead. I had never seen such a creature before, and I knew instantly it was responsible for the wound on my foot. I managed to swim gently back to the shore and observe the creature as I stood there in the sand. My wound still coursing speckles of blood on the sand. So, I limped back to my hut, and after bandaging my foot, tried to use my binoculars to observe if the creature was still there, and if there was any more nearby. I immediately informed my manager, who decided to close that part of the beach for the day. He thought it was just some kind of fish, and that maybe I had just exaggerated the sighting, which is not uncommon when you're being pumped full of adrenaline and fear. But I knew what I saw. So, I took 2 weeks off on medical grounds. Even though my foot healed and I felt better, my nerves were completely wrecked. No one believed me or took me seriously. Not even my girlfriend, friends, or close family. They all believed it was too early in the morning and I was tired. But listen, I know what I saw. It was something monstrous. Some creature that I've never seen before, and I'm not sure if anybody else has. When I returned, the beach was running again as normal, and it was busier than ever. As I sat there in my hut, I looked from left to right, and it was extraordinary hearing and seeing such joy when just 2 weeks before, it had been a scene of terror. I always felt super comfortable working in the sea, having always been an avid swimmer. But as I looked out into the ocean, I felt sick and couldn't imagine anything worse than having to go back into it. Thankfully, there were no incidents in which I needed to rescue anybody. I began to see the creature everywhere. If anyone was swimming with a green t-shirt, my eyes would play tricks and I would shoot up, expecting to see some mayhem and carnage unfold before my eyes. A jolt of fear would trickle down my body, and I would break out in a cold sweat, even though it was ridiculously hot outside. I knew this wasn't a healthy way to live, and so I decided to seek help from my doctor. I started anti-anxiety medication and told the doctor about what I saw. Like everyone else, He put the vision down to stress and asked me if I used any recreational drugs at the time. I was really pissed off. As I sat home during one of my off days, I was surviving off crap food, toast and Twinkies. I couldn't even make love to my girlfriend, and I'm a 28-year-old guy with a beautiful girl. Whatever creature this was, it had unsettled me in a way that I never encountered. Just total anxiety. I even tried listening to some calm music, even some ASMR, but every time I closed my eyes, the large glassy eyes of the beast, cold and monstrous, would send a jolt of panic down my spine, and I would subconsciously flap my arms as if trying to swim away from the horror. I even had a secret desire for the creature to reappear and wound somebody else, so I would know that I had not gone crazy, at least not entirely. As I sat there in my lonely apartment, my phone rang, and it was my manager. He told me I needed to come in, and that I wouldn't want to miss this, and that he believed me. I remember sighing deeply, knowing that when I arrived, there was likely going to be another attack. But I didn't press him for any more details. I told him I would be there as quick as I could. So I took my bike, and I remember I pedaled maniacally. My legs were so numb and felt like jelly when I arrived because I pushed so hard. I didn't even bother to fasten my bike or secure it. I remember I just left it and ran to the office, where I was likely to meet my manager and be informed of whatever had happened. I remember that as I arrived at the office, our reception lady had pointed me to the very edge of the beach, close to the waves, where there was a large crowd that had gathered around what looked like a washed-up animal. It was green and long, and I instantly knew what it was. The beach was empty. It had obviously been evacuated, and there were cops circling around the area with clipboards, taking photographs. It was a surreal sight, like a crime scene right there, like I was living on the real-life set of CSI Miami. No children laughing, no ice cream, just the taste of fear in my mouth as I bit my lips, nearly causing it to bleed with trepidation. My manager had gestured to me to walk down, and I held onto my stomach, hoping I would not churn out the contents of my breakfast. My manager had informed me afterwards that the police had arrived as a beast, a reptilian-like sea creature, had its stomach severed. It was now dead, and it was found to have at least 5 to 6 human remains in its stomach. The remains were obviously detached and fragmented, but there was a forensic team on site who were confident that it was more than just one body. There was also a marine biologist present, taking more photographs and using his portable computer. I remember him squinting over the screen, and he simply didn't know what it was, and that he had never encountered such a thing. I'd asked my colleagues even, but the species was unknown from what I heard. One of the officers had informed me that this would be an ongoing investigation, and that some kind of plan needed to be conjured to stop people from using this section of beach. If word got out that a creature like this was commonly swimming in the water, there would be panic. Thankfully, no real word got out that I'm aware of, so I didn't have to worry about it going viral. And surprisingly, there really hasn't been any images of it that I can find on Google or Pinterest or anything. But of course, to me, the beast was real, and I was attacked by it. Luckily, it should be buried in the past, buried where it can't get to anybody, and nobody has to know it exists. As I write this, I can only thank the universe for protecting me. To have escaped with such a mild wound was amazingly lucky. This creature had obviously been intent on killing me and consuming me. It was a terrible end for anybody. I thought of those poor souls who had met such a tragic end. Had they enjoyed surfing like me? Were they adults, practically children, or were these recent killings of the time? It's not uncommon for surfers and swimmers to go missing or to drown and their bodies to not be recovered. I mean, usually bodies are recovered, but missing persons does happen, even on the ocean. To think that my job, which at the time I had relished and enjoyed so much was now a scene of horror and brutality. Every day, it felt like a nightmare afterwards. That section of beach had been closed all year, and thankfully, once COVID came and hit, it made it easier. But really, it's because we fear another attack. Until the forensics have more information, which I never received, and why would I? I was not an important part of any investigation, really. There was also a team of academics around the world who are aware of beasts like this and creatures that exist. Anyway, we need to keep a lookout for more reptilian creatures like this in the ocean, waiting to emerge to consume anyone or anything. Who knows what let it out here to the coast of this beach? Perhaps its food chain was disrupted, or maybe it changed its sights on what it was wanting to eat. A couple of years ago, my fiance, who was my boyfriend at the time, had his sister invite us to her wedding down in San Diego. We're from New York City, so at first we had the idea to just catch a flight. But then I was struck with a fun idea. I brought up how we could leave a few weeks early and take a leisurely road trip instead. So, by the time we arrived in California, we could take a few days to rest and recharge before the ceremony. I had never really been outside of the East Coast, so I was excited about the idea of being able to take in new sights. You wouldn't be able to see much from 30,000 feet up in the air. After some discussion, we decided that if we were to do such a thing, it would be most convenient to rent a car and return it upon our arrival, instead of just taking our own vehicle. From there, we would simply take a flight home, sparing us from having to take the time to drive all the way back. So, when it came time to leave, we got our rental car, packed our things, and did the standard routine check of making sure the stove, oven, and lights were off, and being sure that the house was locked and left. Most of the trip went as expected. We had our fun days of stopping in different destinations, like Indianapolis and St. Louis, visiting the multiple attractions they had to offer, and our not-so-fun moments of getting caught in heavy traffic, or having to stay in a hotel that was a bit beyond our budget. Regardless, it was pretty cool to be able to experience things I had never had the chance to before. Overall, things went pretty smooth. That is, until we hit New Mexico. It was nighttime, and we ran over something. I'm not sure what it was, but it was enough to cause one of our front tires to pop, and the car was practically bouncing from the roughness that ensued. We pulled over and went to check out the damage. The whole tire was practically shredded, hanging onto the car by a thread. We went to look for a spare tire, and my heart sank as we soon discovered that there wasn't one. The service nor data wasn't very good out where we were, leaving us next to stranded. The good news was that the GPS attached to our car used satellites instead of cell towers, so it was still operating just fine. The bad news was that it used the car as its power source, so it would be rendered useless if we took it out. My fiancé then had an idea. He took out his phone and opened the Notes app and copied the directions to the nearest town. It was about 5 miles out. Upon getting there, we could hopefully find a place to stay and have enough service to call the rental company to let them know about the car and see what we could do from there. We wanted to wait a bit before doing that though, just to see if we could flag down another car to speed up the process. After about 15 minutes or so with nothing, we decided to make our journey on foot. Both of us were very nervous about leaving so many of our belongings behind in the car, but with how much we had packed, it was impossible to take it all with us. We locked the car of course, but that didn't mean it was impossible for somebody to shatter the windows and haul our stuff out, including my dress and his suit, both of which were rather expensive. A few minutes into our journey, I can make out the silhouette of a man running some distance away. It was late, but considering I was with my fiancé, I wasn't exactly scared. I figured it was just a late-night jogger, although I couldn't understand why he chose to run across the land instead of by the street. Then, he turned around, and the new angle allowed me to see something trailing behind him. I squinted my eyes, trying to make out what it was. It wasn't until then that I noticed how bizarre his face shape was. It was much more rectangular than I'd ever seen on a person. I had to ask my fiancé, "What is that?" from beside me. I told him I didn't know. My best guess was a strange-looking person. The man only seemed to be getting closer, and I turned on my phone's flashlight. I gasped as the light caused the man's eyes to reflect back at us. Then, I was able to see his form in its entirety. Its frame was at a bit of an obtuse angle, with the bumps of its spine sticking out like spikes. Its arms were significantly shorter than its legs, and its hands only appeared to have 4 fingers, with long, sharp, black nails at the end of each one. Its face resembled that of a person's, but it was so bizarrely shaped for being such that it was practically uncanny. Its eyes were like that of a snake's, and I soon realized that the thing had been trailing behind its body was in fact its tail. It had no skin. In fact, it appeared to be covered head to toe in dark green scales. This creature hissed at us, revealing a long snake-like tongue that was previously hidden with its mouth. My fiancé and I ran, screaming and yelling for help as we did. This thing paced itself behind us, continuing to hiss and snarl. Some distance below, I can make out the lights of a small town. However, we were too high up on the cliff we were on to safely navigate our way down. Instead, we had to keep following the road, which wind down into the city, and who knew how long that could take. I then thought of something. I stopped in my tracks, picking up a few rocks nearby. My fiancé asked what I was doing. I turned around and threw one at the creature. The first one missed, but the second one hit it right in the forehead. It made a noise of pain and stopped briefly, shaking its head. My fiancé and I continued running, but this monster only seemed to be even angrier. It picked up its pace, and it wasn't terribly fast, but neither were we, and I had no idea whether or not we had enough stamina to outrun whatever this was. Once we were nearly down the cliff, a car had driven past us, loudly honking its horn as we were far too close for his or her liking. The creature screeched and ran off somewhere to the side, but we continued moving forward. It didn't seem to follow us anymore, but we weren't going to take any chances. As we neared the entrance of town, we finally allowed ourselves to catch our breath. We walked into a nearby McDonald's, got ourselves water before anything else, and then sat down in one of the booths, taking a minute to try and piece together what had just happened. My fiancé tried to lighten up the moment by reminding me that we, in fact, did end up making it to our destination. We tried calling the rental company, but we just got an automated message that their offices were closed for the night and that we needed to call back in the morning. Not knowing what else to do, we walked to a small hotel and rented a room. We were exhausted, and despite what had just happened, fell asleep easily. It definitely helped that we had each other. The morning after, we called the rental company before anything else. They said that they would send out a tow truck to get the car fixed, and that we could pick up the car in town later that day. We checked out of the hotel and went back to the McDonald's and had breakfast. My fiancé says the closest thing he could find to what he saw was a chupacabra. But even then, some depictions made it appear as if it were a dog or a coyote-like creature, not a reptilian-looking thing. So we were left pretty stumped as to what the hell it was. Whatever the case, I was just glad it wasn't after us anymore. We spent the day wandering around the town as we waited for that call if our car was fixed, but there really wasn't much to see. When we finally received the phone call, we picked up our car and made sure everything was still there. When it appeared to be fine, we stopped by a gas station to pee, fill up the car, and get some snacks. When we were ready to get back on the road again, both of us let out a little laugh as we realized that we would have to return to the same place we were chased down in order to get back on track for San Diego. Upon our return to the road, I swore I could see webbed footprints lightly imprinted in the more sandy areas of the terrain. But I just shook my head and let myself relax, putting my feet up on the dashboard. The rest of our trip was fine, and we managed to make the best of it despite what had happened. By the time the wedding ceremony came around, we found ourselves telling the tale over and over again to different groups of people. A lot of people didn't take it too seriously, as to be expected, and to be fair, neither did we. Pretending it was just something stupid made it easier to cope with, I guess. A lot of people brought up the chupacabra thing, just like my fiancé did, and others joked it was somebody from the town trying to scare away the tourists. You know, the whole Scooby-Doo thing. We eventually flew back to New York, and it never really came up beyond that point. After all, we had other things to attend in our lives, like our jobs and social events. Still, it wasn't long after before my fiancé proposed to me, and I do think that event, along with the inspiration from his sister's wedding, played a heavy role in his decision to do so. Maybe I'm reading a bit much into it, but to me, it symbolized that life could throw all sorts of crazy stuff at you, and that if you can handle such an intense experience with a person you love and make it through okay, then the two of you could take on anything. Things like bills would be nothing in comparison to what we went through. Anyway, I've never returned to the Southwest region since, and I don't really plan to. I'm not exactly scared of stumbling upon that reptile man again, considering it was in rural New Mexico, and I don't exactly have a reason to go back there. Still, it makes me wonder what other kinds of creatures are out in the world, waiting for unsuspecting victims to come across them, perhaps even where I reside. Whatever the case, I'm just glad I live in a place where there aren't many reptiles, or reptile men.